The landlocked heart of southern Africa does not shout. It does not scream for recognition the way ancient empires do. There are no pyramids here, no carved obelisks towering toward the sky. But if you listen closely, beneath the hum of wind across Zambia's Miambo woodlands, there's a murmur. Not a voice of a single people, but an ancient chorus stitched into the genome of every Zambian alive today. Zambia, a quiet crossroads bordered by 8 nations, is often left out of the grand narratives of African history. But in the language of DNA, its importance is anything but silent. It is here that southern, central, and eastern Africa once met, not in trade, but in blood, not in stone, but in cells. And it is here that humanity left behind one of its most intricate puzzles, a genetic mosaic painted not on cave walls, but across generations of living people. For years, researchers thought they understood Zambia's ancestry. Most Zambians, they concluded, were descendants of the Bantu expansion, a wave of farming peoples who swept out of West Africa over 4,000 years ago, reaching Zambia roughly 2 millennia ago. These Bantu migrants brought millet, iron, and language. Their demographic footprint was enormous. Their culture dominant. Their genes. It was believed they nearly erased everything that came before. But that theory was only the surface, a single layer on a much older tapestry, because buried within Zambian DNA are echoes that do not align with West African lineages, genes that whisper of a time before farming, before migration routes, before iron blades cut through the undergrowth. These markers come from populations so old their names were never written down, and yet they are not gone. Fragments of them persist within the lungs, livers, and limbs of those who walk Zambia's villages and cities today. Recent genomic studies have shattered the simplicity of the Bantu-only model. Through high-density SNP analysis and uniparental markers, scientists discovered that nearly all modern Zambians, Bemba, Lozi, Tonga, even groups long considered genetically uniform, carry the faint traces of much older peoples. On average, 10 to 13% of their DNA is not Bantu at all. It is the legacy of foragers who lived here long before the first farmer sowed a seed. But in some, those echoes are louder. In a group called the BaTwa, especially those from the Kafue Flats and Lake Bangulu, the past is not a whisper, it's a song. Up to 31% of their genetic ancestry comes from pre-Bantu hunter-gatherers, a lineage that is neither entirely Khoisan nor Pygmy. It falls somewhere in between, a ghost population that no longer exists in pure form, except here, buried in the genes of the living. The idea that Zambia was simply a waypoint in the Bantu march from west to east is now obsolete. This was not just a corridor. It was a crucible, a place where ancient peoples met, mixed, and left behind more than pottery shards or bones. They left behind codes, silent, enduring, elegant, codes that science is only now beginning to decipher. What does it mean to be Zambian? It is no longer a question that ends at language or agriculture. It is not just a West African story. It is something deeper. To be Zambian is to carry the legacy of convergence. It is to inherit bloodlines shaped by rivers, shaped by rainfall, shaped by tens of thousands of years of survival. It is to walk a land where DNA holds more history than the soil itself. There are no ruins to mark their kingdoms, no written language, no names passed down in carved stone. But they were here, the first people of what we now call Zambia. For thousands of years, they lived without agriculture, without metal, without maps. Yet their story has outlasted even empires. Not in monuments, not in oral tradition, but in something far more resilient, DNA. Long before the Bantu-speaking farmers arrived with seeds and iron, this land was already home. Dense forests, wide floodplains, and seasonal rivers cradled society of hunter-gatherers, people whose lives depended not on ownership of land, but on an intimate knowledge of it. They knew the scent of coming rain, the migration of antelope, the silent language of trees. But who were they? That question haunted archaeologists for decades. There were clues, stone tools, traces of hearths, paintings on rock, but no clear identity. Until genetics began to speak. Until a small, often overlooked community stepped forward with the answer written in their chromosomes. The BaTwa. You've heard the name before, maybe dismissed as a marginalized group. But genetically, The BaTwa are a living archive. When scientists sequenced their DNA, what they found wasn't just surprising, it rewrote history. In the Kafue region, nearly one-third of BaTwa ancestry traces back to people who lived here long before the Bantu ever saw the Zambezi. Not 500 years ago, not 1,000, but tens of thousands. And yet, these ancient ancestors were not the same as the Khoisan of the Kalahari, nor the Pygmies of the Congo. Their genetic code sits in between, like a missing branch on the African family tree. A people who once thrived, and then vanished, not through violence, but through absorption. Let that sink in. A population that no longer exists in pure form is still alive inside the bones of a child in Kafue. A forgotten lineage that survives not through language or memory, but through molecules passed down, mother to daughter, father to son. Is it possible for someone to carry the legacy of a civilization they've never heard of? It is. And in Zambia, it happens every day. Look at a map, and you won't find the names of these people. Look at a face, and you might not see them. But look at the genes, and suddenly, they return. Not as myth, not as theory, but as evidence. Ancient humans, uniquely adapted to the ecology of Zambia's highlands and rivers, encoded with mutations distinct from any known population today. A genetic fingerprint the world had forgotten, until the BaTwa opened the door. What makes this discovery more powerful is that it almost didn't happen. For years, research ignored marginalized groups like the BaTwa. Focus was placed on dominant farming populations. The idea of a forager legacy in Zambia, it was dismissed. But when scientists finally turned their attention to these invisible people, everything changed. One genome at a time, an entire lost population began to emerge. And what do we call them? We can't. They had no written name. But they left behind something far stronger than ink. Their legacy is now part of the very biology of modern Zambians, not as a museum relic, but as living ancestry. What does that mean for us? It means identity isn't what we've been told. It's not just language or skin color or cultural practice. It's also the ancient code within us, the unseen inheritance that shapes how we digest food, how we fight disease, how we survive. And for the BaTwa, it's proof. Proof that they are not remnants of a lost world. They are the world that came before. So ask yourself, how many other forgotten peoples still whisper through our veins? What other stories are we carrying in silence? Because if the BaTwa taught us one thing, it's this. Just because a people vanish from sight doesn't mean they vanish from history. Imagine a ripple, small at first, like a drop falling into a still lake. But then it spreads. Wider, deeper, stronger. Now imagine that ripple is not water, but people, language, technology, DNA. This is the story of the Bantu Migration, a tidal wave of humanity that swept across Africa, changing not just cultures, but the very biology of millions. But how does a migration reshape a genome? Start here. Around 4,000 years ago, in the green highlands between Nigeria and Cameroon, something began to stir. Small groups of farmers, speaking what would become Bantu languages, began moving, first slowly, then in unstoppable waves. They brought with them something revolutionary, the ability to farm, to clear forest, to settle. And with that power came population growth, expansion, conquest, and contact. They moved southward, eastward, across rainforests, rivers, and mountains. And then they reached Zambia. This wasn't a peaceful arrival. It wasn't violent, either. Not in the way empires fall. It was something more complicated. The Bantu didn't need swords. Their strength was in numbers, in knowledge, in time. When they reached Zambia's fertile valleys, Luangwa, Kafue, Zambezi, they encountered people already there. Foragers, hunters, small, isolated communities who had lived in tune with the land for thousands of years. These weren't battles of armies. These were battles of biology, demographic pressure, cultural displacement, and genetic dominance. Within a few centuries, the scale had tipped. The incoming farmers didn't just bring millet and iron. They brought genes that would come to dominate over 85% of modern Zambian ancestry. That's not speculation. It's confirmed through genome-wide data. The Bemba, Tonga, Lozi, all carry overwhelming proportions of DNA tracing back to West Central African ancestors. It's like a genetic map that keeps pointing to the same place: Cameroon, Nigeria, the heartland of the Bantu dispersal. But here's where it gets fascinating. Not everything was replaced. Because if it was, we wouldn't still find echoes of older lineages, whispers of hunter-gatherer DNA peeking through. If the Bantu had completely erased what came before, there would be no BaTwa, no L0 mitochondrial haplogroups, no paternal haplogroup B2 lingering like an ancient ember. Instead, we see a different story. One of admixture, one of relationships, one of slow, steady transformation. Think of it like ink dropped into water. The color spreads, but it doesn't completely mask what's underneath. Instead, it fuses. It evolves. The DNA of Zambia today is not a monument to conquest. It's a record of entanglement. But how did this transformation happen? It wasn't just about movement. It was about who moved. Genetic studies show a strong male-biased migration. Bantu men traveled, often marrying local women from forager populations. That's why we see West African Y-DNA markers dominating paternal lines, but ancient forager mtDNA passed through mothers, quietly surviving. The Bantu didn't just arrive, they absorbed. Pause and think. How many of us are walking mosaics of history we don't remember? How many of our traits, our risks, our strengths were forged in unions that happened centuries ago, without a word being written down? The Bantu expansion didn't just bring agriculture. It brought genes for adaptation, to malaria, to different climates, to new diets. It introduced alleles that changed how people processed starch, how they absorbed iron, even how they resisted infections. It seeded the genetic groundwork for entire future populations. And yet, as powerful as that migration was, it wasn't a clean sweep. Zambia remains one of the most genetically layered places in Africa. A place where history isn't written on walls. It's woven into the double helix of every child born today. So the next time someone tells you a people disappeared, ask them to look again. Not in books, not in ruins, but in blood. Some inherit land, others inherit names. But in Zambia, many have inherited something older, quieter, something forged in survival, passed not through stories, but through molecules. This is not just ancestry. This is blood memory. And it carries the imprints of choices made by ancestors who never knew we'd be watching. Why did some children survive malaria while others didn't? Why could certain communities drink milk without illness when others couldn't tolerate a drop? These aren't random differences. They're evidence of genetic battles fought in the shadows of time, battles against disease, hunger, and extinction. Let's go deeper. Start with the sickle cell gene. It's not just a mutation, it's a weapon. One that allowed people in malaria-infested regions to live while others perished. In Zambia, where malaria shaped history as much as kings or migrations, the sickle cell trait is common, not by chance, but by necessity. Carriers of just one copy of the gene were less likely to die of malaria in childhood. That meant they lived long enough to pass that gene on, and on, and on. But there's a trade-off. 2 copies. That leads to sickle cell disease, a painful, life-threatening condition. So why didn't natural selection eliminate it? Because for every child born with the disease, many more were protected. It's brutal math, but it's how evolution works. Now shift your gaze to another gene, G6PD deficiency, a small variation in an enzyme. Yet in Zambia, this subtle tweak once meant the difference between life and death. Like the sickle trait, it offers protection against malaria. Another example of how environmental pressure didn't just shape culture, it sculpted the genome itself. But survival wasn't only about disease. It was about food, too. In Zambia's southern regions, some groups, like the Tonga and Lozi, began herding cattle thousands of years ago. And as dairy entered their diets, something remarkable happened: the emergence of lactase persistence. Most people on Earth lose the ability to digest milk after childhood. But not here. A specific mutation in the LCD gene allowed some Zambians to continue breaking down lactose into adulthood. It didn't come from Bantu farmers. It likely came from ancient pastoralists, absorbed into the gene pool through intermarriage and adaptation. What's the lesson? Culture doesn't just shape behavior. It leaves fingerprints on DNA. Even more astonishing are the discoveries in immune system genes. In southern African populations, researchers have identified rare variants in genes like TRIM5 and APOBEC3G, genes that act like molecular sentinels against viruses. These aren't minor defenses. These are elite units, forged by centuries of exposure to retroviruses like HIV's ancient ancestors. Zambia, situated at the nexus of disease environments, became a crucible for immunity. Not because its people were weaker, but because their ancestors had no choice but to become stronger. And it's not just about what we've inherited. It's also about what we're still evolving. Modern studies in Zambia have found links between gene variants and childhood stunting, a condition rooted in poor nutrition and chronic gut inflammation. One study found that genes involved in neuronal development and fatty acid metabolism may play a role in whether a child grows to full potential. These insights don't just inform biology, they shape future health policy. Now pause. Look in the mirror. What if the way your body processes food, fights infection, or reacts to medication was shaped by a moment of crisis 2,000 years ago? A drought, a fever, a lost child. What if your strengths today were born from someone else's suffering and their decision to keep going? That's blood memory. It's more than DNA. It's resilience encoded. It's the body remembering what history forgot. Zambia's people are not just descendants of migration. They are survivors of evolution's harshest tests. Each allele, each variant, each rare adaptation tells a story. Not of triumph, always, but of persistence. And that persistence? It's still unfolding. In labs, in clinics, in the quiet miracle of a child surviving where once they would not have. If you could see your DNA on a map, where would it point? To a country? A tribe? A single ancestor? In Zambia, the answer isn't so simple. Because when scientists charted Zambian genomes, they didn't find a straight line. They found a triangle, a vast, invisible shape with three corners: West African farmers, Central African forest dwellers, and Southern African foragers. And the people in the middle? The BaTwa. But this isn't a triangle drawn on land, it's one drawn in data. Through a powerful tool called principal components analysis, scientists took thousands of genetic markers and plotted them in 3D space. Think of it like a constellation made from chromosomes. And what they saw changed everything. Most Bantu-speaking groups in Zambia cluster near one corner of the triangle, close to their West African ancestors. That makes sense. Over 85% of their DNA comes from the massive Bantu migration. But then you look at the BaTwa, and something shifts. Their genomes drift away from the Bantu corner, toward a space between the ancient sand of Kalahari and the rainforest hunter-gatherers of the Congo Basin. Why? What explains that genetic drift? It's because the BaTwa carries something almost no one else does: the legacy of a ghost population. A group so old, so genetically distinct, it doesn't fully match any known lineage. Their DNA is not a copy of the San. It's not a mirror of the Pygmies. It's something else. Something in between. Something lost. And yet, not completely lost. Because traces of that ancient genome still breathe through the BaTwa. Through every blood cell, every strand of hair. Through every heartbeat of a child born near the Bangula wetlands. But here's the twist. This isn't about one tribe. It's about all of us. Because even Zambian Bantu groups like the Tonga, Lozi, and Bemba, despite their majority West African ancestry, also show a subtle pull toward that same triangle center. A small, quiet gravitational tug toward an origin that predates farming, predates metallurgy, predates history itself. What does it mean when people unknowingly carry the DNA of ancestors no one remembered? It means that Zambia isn't just a place on a map, it's a living archive. A junction where the deepest splits in the human family tree gently reconnect. And the triangle isn't just a diagram. It's a story of movement, fusion, and survival. Zoom in, and you'll see it more clearly. The Kafui BaTwa, with up to 31% of their DNA pulling them away from the Bantu corner, floating like genetic time capsules. The Bangula BaTwa, a little closer to the center, still distinct, still irreplaceable. And that unique pattern, It doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth. Why does that matter? Because in the world of genetics, intermediates are priceless. They act like fossils, except instead of bones, they preserve entire genomic histories. And the BaTwa preserve a lineage we never would have known existed if their DNA hadn't spoken first. It's no exaggeration to say that without them, part of Africa's ancestral map would be blank. So the next time someone tells you about identity, ask them this. What if your real homeland isn't a place you can point to, but a position in a triangle drawn by your ancestors' footsteps? The BaTwa didn't choose to become archives, but by surviving, they became something no ancient DNA can replicate, a bridge between the forgotten and the living. Not all memory lives in the mind. Some of it lives deeper, in bone marrow, in blood chemistry, in the silent switches of your genome. A memory you didn't choose, can't recall, but carry every single day. In Zambia, that kind of memory isn't metaphor, it's biology. DNA doesn't just tell us where we come from. It tells us what we survived. But what does survival look like in molecular form? Let's start in a place where few scientists looked until recently: the body's response to disease. In Zambia, infectious threats weren't occasional, they were constant. Malaria, sleeping sickness, bacterial infections, waterborne illnesses, generation after generation, the land tested its people. And those who survived? They passed on not just their names, but their genetic defenses. Some of those defenses are subtle. Take the ApoBec3G gene, a powerful antiviral protein. It edits viral DNA inside the cell, cutting it apart before it can replicate. Scientists have discovered unique variations of this gene in African populations, including Zambians, that aren't seen anywhere else. They likely evolved under pressure from ancient retroviruses, viruses that may no longer even exist, but whose ghost left behind genetic armor. Then there's TRIM5, another internal defense system, a molecular gatekeeper that blocks viruses from unlocking a cell. Variants of TRIM5 in Zambia show signs of strong selection. Translation: this isn't just coincidence. This is evidence of a war, one fought not with weapons, but with white blood cells and silent mutations. But protection doesn't always come in the form of immunity. Sometimes it's about how we digest, what we can eat, what we can't. In several southern Zambian groups, people have a remarkable genetic ability. They can digest milk long after infancy. In most of the world, that's impossible. But here, it's relatively common. This adaptation, called lactase persistence, is the product of an ancient gene variant likely introduced through contact with East African pastoralists. Once inside the population, it spread rapidly. Why? Because in environments where food was scarce and cattle were lifelines, being able to digest milk meant life or death. Now ask yourself, what if the foods your body craves, or rejects, aren't just personal preferences, but evolutionary echoes? We're not done. In modern Zambia, malnutrition remains a critical issue. But even here, genetics plays a hidden role. Recent genome-wide studies on Zambian children revealed specific SNPs linked to growth and nutrient processing. These genes don't just respond to the environment. They reflect centuries of adaptation to it. They try and keep up, even as modern challenges evolve faster than biology can catch them. And what about medicine? Pharmacogenomics, the science of how your genes affect your response to drugs, is beginning to reveal Zambian-specific patterns. Certain variants in the CYP450 enzyme family, crucial for breaking down medications, occur at different frequencies in Zambia compared to European or Asian populations. That means the very way your body handles treatment, antimalarials, HIV drugs, even basic antibiotics, may be fundamentally different. And if global health doesn't adjust to that, it fails. This is an academic theory. This is why people live or die. So why is it only now that we're paying attention? Because for too long, African genomes were underrepresented. Most global genetic studies focused on Europeans. Even though Africa holds the highest genetic diversity on Earth, it was left in the margins. Not anymore. Today, initiatives like H3 Africa are placing Zambian data at the center of global medical research, not as a curiosity, but as a key. Because if we want truly universal medicine, we have to start where it all began, with the most diverse, complex, and ancient genomes humanity has ever known. And Zambia. It holds some of the most important pieces. There was a time, not long ago, when scientists looked at Africa and saw only gaps, missing data, blank spots on genetic maps. And in that silence, stories vanished. Histories were erased, not by conquest, but by omission. But Zambia? Zambia was one of those forgotten chapters. Until the DNA started speaking. For decades, global genetics was built on a narrow foundation, mostly European genomes, studied, cataloged, analyzed. Meanwhile, the richest reservoir of human diversity was sidelined. African populations like Zambia's, complex, ancient, and irreplaceable, were labeled too complicated to include, too diverse, too hard to interpret. But what happens when you ignore the most ancient branch of the human tree? You get an incomplete picture. You miss the core. You misunderstand evolution itself. Zambia's DNA isn't just diverse, it's structurally unique. A genetic melting point where multiple deep-rooted lineages meet. West African, Central Forager, Eastern Pastoralist, and a shadow population that no longer exists in unmixed form. That convergence isn't noise. It's a key to understanding all of us. Let's break that down. When genome projects finally started incorporating Zambian samples, researchers didn't just fill in blanks. They discovered entire undocumented ancestries. Some genes didn't match anything in global databases, not European, not Asian, not even known African references. They represented a legacy of populations that had been missing from the scientific record until now. And it wasn't just Ancestry. In a 2022 ancient DNA study, researchers sequenced a human from Zambia's Kalimba rock shelter, dated over 5,000 years ago. That individual carried a rare combination of Eastern African and Southern Forager ancestry. But here's the twist. That genetic mix has barely changed in the region since then, meaning Zambia has preserved a genomic pattern that's over 5 millennia old. In other words, modern Zambians aren't just descendants of the past. They are the past, still encoded with the same signatures as the people who lived here before metal, before migration, before memory. Ask yourself, how many countries can say that? But the impact goes beyond anthropology. In medical research, the consequences of exclusion are deadly. Treatments based on non-African data can misfire. Diagnostic thresholds can fail. A medicine that works for a Dutch or Japanese genome might behave differently in a Zambian body. And no one would know, because no one checked. That's finally changing. Initiatives like H3 Africa and local collaborations in Lusaka and the Copperbelt are building African-led genomic databases. These aren't just scientific projects, they're acts of justice, acts of restoration. They're returning agency to the people whose biology has been mined but rarely understood on its own terms. Zambia isn't just contributing data, it's redefining the model. With over 3 million novel genetic variants identified in recent studies, it's becoming clear. The so-called edge of science was never an edge. It was the center, waiting to be seen. So what was almost missed? The evidence of ancient foragers, hidden inside people who speak modern languages. Disease resistance genes adapted to local viruses no one outside Africa ever faced. Mitochondrial lineages older than agriculture. And perhaps most importantly, a view of human evolution not from the outside, but from within. In the rush to sequence genomes, the world nearly overlooked one of the most crucial regions for understanding our species. But Zambia waited, and when science was finally ready to listen, the truth came rushing back, not as theory, but as bloodline. What do you call a legacy that leaves no monuments behind? No palaces, no scrolls, just blood, just breath, just code. In Zambia, the most powerful inheritance isn't visible from space. It's inherited at birth, hidden in every cell, and older than history itself. The story of Zambian DNA is not just the record of people, it's the record of peoplehood itself. Because when scientists decode Zambian genomes, they're not just studying Zambia. They're uncovering how all humans became who we are. Look deeper. This is where the Bantu migrations converged, where ancient foragers retreated, resisted, and merged, where Central African, Eastern African, and Southern hunter-gatherer ancestry didn't collide, they wove together. Zambia's genetic signature isn't a straight line, it's a spiral. It loops through migrations, bottlenecks, droughts, births, losses, and yet it holds. And the most astonishing part? Much of it still survives today. Modern populations, like the Tonga, Lozi, Bemba, and BaTwa, carry fragments of ancestries older than agriculture. They walk through modern life, carrying the blueprints of vanished worlds. Some carry mitochondrial haplogroups that trace maternal lines back 50,000 years. Others carry Y chromosome markers, passed from father to son, for 2,000 generations. But no one told them that, because this inheritance doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a ceremony. It's not sung at weddings. It lives in bone and breath, waiting to be read, waiting to be respected. That's why this science matters. Not to collect data, not to impress conferences, but to give people back what colonial borders, academic bias, and silence took away. Their depth. Zambia's people are not just Bantu speakers. They are not just descendants of farmers. They are not even just Africans. They are archives of a species that has spent 200,000 years crossing rivers, climbing hills, loving, losing, and enduring. And that archive, it's alive. In you, in your children, in the quiet code humming beneath your skin. Every single genetic marker, whether it shaped resistance to malaria, allowed survival through famine, or adapted to new climates, is not just a mutation. It's a message that says, we were here, we adapted, we endured, and you are living proof of it. So ask yourself, what do we owe to the ancestors who passed down more than land or language, but the very instructions for how to live? Can we honor them by learning their names? By understanding their struggles, not as footnotes, but as the very reason we're alive? Can we protect this inheritance, not in museums, but in memory, in medicine, in education? Because what Zambia holds is not just its own story. It's a mirror for humanity. A final thought. When the world looks for the origin of strength, it often looks in the wrong places. It looks at weapons, at flags, at monuments. But in Zambia, strength was encoded differently. Not in what people built, but in how they survived.